Hello everyone. The American Imperialism lecture is going to be the first lecture that kind of starts off our World War I section of the class. This is kind of the lead into World War I if you notice the dates. This is going to be a very turbulent time in American history. A lot of empire building, conflicts abroad, foreign policy. We're going to have things like the Panama Canal. We're going to have some issues with Mexico. So there's a lot of change going on in this time period, and this will be one of the longer lectures in the course. So just make sure that you're checking with the notes, you're making sure that you're following along in the book, and you're understanding how we get from the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era into World War I. Imperialism in the United States, though it began much earlier, think the Monroe Doctrine in the 1830s, took off with the closing of the Western frontier in the 1890s. Many Americans believed that the U.S. had either to expand or explode. Their increasing population, the growing wealth, and increased industrial production dramatically increased America's demand for resources and pushed many to seek those resources in foreign lands, specifically Latin America and Asia. Some Americans feared that the existing resources in the U.S. would dry up. This belief, added to the Panic of 1893, convinced some businessmen that new markets were needed to compensate for America's overproduction of goods. Labor violence and agrarian unrest, or farmer unrest, specifically the populist movement, had become rampant due to industrialization, and many turned to expansion abroad as the solution. Overseas markets were seen as a safety valve for the United States' internal pressures. The theory of seeking new lands and markets also was not uncommon to the American people. The experience of subjugating the Plains Indians after the Civil War had established a precedence for exerting colonial control over dependent peoples. Foreign trade during this time period became increasingly important to the U.S. economy, causing some to take this expansion one step further and begin seeking to establish new colonies to further expand existing markets. All of these factors combined with the general desire for America to become a power that would be able to compete with the larger European empires, and some sought to create America as a great power internationally. During the period between 1870 and 1900, Europeans possessed over 1/5 of the land and 1/10 of the population of the world. Germany in particular was the U.S.'s biggest imperialist foe. Germany spurred the U.S. into imperialist actions due to their desire to colonize areas of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, all areas that the U.S. sought to expand their own foreign markets. Imperialism was also pushed along by influential figures. The most notable is Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, that encouraged the growth of the American naval complex with his thesis stating that the control of the seas was the key to world dominance. Mahan argued that the U.S. should build a large navy and defensive bases, as well as fueling stations in strategic places on the world's oceans. His views would encourage Americans to take Hawaii and other Pacific islands in an attempt to achieve these goals. Mahan also argued that the U.S. should build a canal across the Isthmus of Central America. This will eventually lead to the creation of Panama Canal. Mahan's views helped stimulate the naval race among the great powers and persuaded yellow journalists to push for a modern U.S. Navy made up of steel ships. As a result, by 1898, the U.S. had the 5th most powerful navy in the world. By 1900, we had the 3rd. Also highly influential was Josiah Strong. Remember his connection to Darwinism? Again, Strong wrote Our Country in 1885, which advocated the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon civilization. Josiah Strong urged the U.S. to spread religion and democracy to the backwards, quote, backwards people, those not part of Europe. And this was an idea that was supported by some of the leading politicians of the time, like Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge. The concept of American imperialism and the creation of America as a great power began with President Monroe and the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which became the basis of much of America's foreign policy during this period. In his December 2, 1823 address to Congress, President James Monroe articulated United States policy on the new political order developing in the rest of the Americas and their role in the Western Hemisphere. The statement known as the Monroe Doctrine was little noted by great powers of Europe when it was initially presented, but it eventually became a long-standing tenet of U.S. foreign policy. Monroe and his then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams drew upon a foundation of American diplomatic ideals such as disentanglement from European affairs and defense of neutral rights as expressions in Washington's farewell address and Madison's statement of the war address for 1812. The three main concepts of the doctrine were the separation of influence, separate spheres of power for the Eastern and Western hemispheres, non-colonization, and non-intervention. Monroe's administration forewarned the imperial European powers against intervening in the affairs of the newly independent Latin American states or potential U.S. territories. While Americans generally objected to European colonies in the New World, they also desired to increase U.S. influence and trading ties throughout the region to their south. European mercantilism posed the greatest obstacles to economic expansion. In particular, Americans feared that the Spanish and the French might reassert colonialism over Latin American peoples who had just overthrown European rule. By the mid-1800s, Monroe's Declaration had combined with ideas of manifest destiny, provided precedents and support for U.S. expansion on the American continent. In the late 1800s, the U.S. economy and military power enabled it to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine's greatest expansion came when Theodore Roosevelt's corollary was delivered, which we'll talk about further in another slide, which inverted the original meaning of the doctrine and came to justify unilateral U.S. intervention in Latin America. In the 1880s, the Secretary of State under President Garfield and Benjamin Harrison, James G. Blaine, sought Latin American support of U.S. leadership in the opening of Latin American markets to U.S. trade. Essentially, Blaine wanted a guarantee of U.S. dominance in the Latin American societies in the 1880s. As a result of this desire to expand, the U.S. and Latin America held the first ever Pan-American Conference in Washington, D.C. in 1889. At the conference, the U.S. proposals were rejected by all of the attending Latin American countries, but the proposals creation of an international American customs union was not appealing because European goods were cheaper for Latin Americans than American products. Another proposal, one for a hemispheric arbitration organization, was also rejected. Latin America feared the dominance of the United States, which they should. The United States did come in and kind of take over later on. The conference overall, though, does show willingness of Latin America to work with the United States and ended up opening the door for future conferences between Latin America and the United States that were far more successful. Attempts continued to gain inroads into Latin America. One of the good examples of this is the Venezuela boundary dispute. America became entangled in this boundary dispute between 1895 and 1896. The dispute stemmed from the boundary between the British Guiana and Venezuela, which had been argued for half a century. This issue intensified when gold was discovered in the border, the disputed region, and it led to President Cleveland warning Britain not to take Venezuela territory, arguing that if they did attempt to take this territory, they would be violating the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted that the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere had superiority. Cleveland argued that London should submit the dispute for arbitration or legal resolution. Britain denied the legality of the Monroe Doctrine and refused to negotiate as a means of resolution. In response, Cleveland got support from Congress to create a commission of experts that would determine an equitable border between Venezuela and the British Guiana. If Britain refused to accept this proposed border, the U.S. would go to war. Britain didn't want to go to war with America despite having a vastly superior navy. Britain this time was also entangled in the Boer Wars in South Africa. Canada was still vulnerable as a British colony, as were British merchant vessels. Britain was worried about Germany's navy and Russia and French ambitions. They feared going to war with the United States would lead to powers also becoming involved. So in the end, Britain consented to negotiate. The prestige of the Monroe Doctrine as a result was enhanced, and Latin American republics were impressed by America's apparent determination to protect them from European empires. Britain also sought a U.S. friendship out of this conflict as a means for them to counter the threat of fellow European empires. The success of this dispute for the U.S. allowed them to aggressively pursue foreign policy. Since the early 19th century, the U.S. came to view Hawaii as an extension of the U.S. Pacific coast. America's annexation of Hawaii in 1898 extended U.S. territory into the Pacific and resulted in the rise of the U.S. as a Pacific power. For most of the 1800s, leaders in Washington were concerned that Hawaii might become a part of European nations' empires. During the 1830s, Britain and France forced Hawaii to accept treaties giving them economic privileges. In 1842, the Secretary of State Daniel Webster sent a letter to Hawaiian agents in Washington affirming U.S. interest in Hawaii and opposing annexation by any other nation. He also proposed to Great Britain and France that no nation should seek special privileges or engage in further colonization of the islands. In 1849, the United States and Hawaii concluded a treaty of friendship that served as the basis of official relations between the parties. A key provision for American whaling ships, fertile ground for American Protestant missioners, and a new source of sugarcane production, Hawaii's economy became increasingly integrated in the United States. In 1875, Trade Reciprocity Treaty further linked the two countries, and U.S. sugar plantation owners from the United States came to dominate the economy of the islands. When Queen Liliuokalani moved to establish a stronger monarchy, Americans under the leadership of Samuel Dole deposed her in 1893. This was also in the midst of the 1893 panic. The planters believed that the coup of annexation by the United States would remove the threat of devastating tariffs on their sugar, also spurred them to action. The administration of President Benjamin Harris encouraged the takeover and dispatched sailors from the USS Boston to the island to surround the royal palace. The U.S. Minister to Hawaii, John L. Stevens, worked closely with the new government. Stevens said, quote, "The Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, and this is the golden hour for the U.S. to pluck it." Dole sent a delegation to Washington in 1894 seeking annexation, but the new president, Grover Cleveland, opposed annexation, refusing to sign any annexation bill and instead tried to restore the Queen. Cleveland sent a special investigator to Hawaii who found out that the majority of Hawaiians did not favor annexation and resented America for its establishment of provisional government by force. Cleveland responded by ordering U.S. troops removed from the island. Despite the efforts of President Cleveland, Dole declared Hawaii an independent republic, spurred by the nationalism aroused by the Spanish-American War. The U.S. eventually does annex Hawaii in 1898 at the urging of President William McKinley. Hawaii was made a territory in 1900, and Dole, of course, became its first governor. Racial attitudes and party politics in the U.S. deferred statehood until a bipartisan compromise linked Hawaii's status to Alaska, and both became states in 1959. The atrocities of Spain and Cuba were greatly exaggerated by sensationalist journalists. The Spanish misrule, combined with the high Wilson-Gorgon tariff of 1894, had damaged Cuba's sugar-based economy. Many of the sugar plantations began to feel this economic crunch. Many of them were owned by American businessmen. The tensions with Spain led to a new Cuban rebellion, which resulted in American property loss in the 1890s. In response to the increasing pushback by Cubans, the Spanish instituted the plan of reconcentration, whereby the Spanish military concentrated masses of Cuban civilians in areas under their direct military control. During this process, about 100,000 Cubans perished between 1896 and 1898. Spain's leader in Cuba, Valeriano Weyler, came to be known as Butcher Weyler by U.S. media due to his poor treatment of the Cuban civilians during reconcentration. Despite growing public concern in the U.S., President Cleveland refused to intervene and instead issued a proclamation of neutrality. The U.S. extended an offer of medication and help, but the Spanish refused. The press saw Cuba as a cash cow and competed intensely with one another over newspaper sales related to the conflicts on the island. Hearst sent artist Frederick Remington to Cuba to draw sketches of the conflict. When Remington reported back that the conditions were not bad enough to warrant sensationalist stories and hostilities, Hearst responded with, quote, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war," end quote. In response, Remington depicted a Spanish customs official as brutally disrobing and searching an American woman, but in reality, this was duty of the female attendants only. The press and their altered truths fueled public outrage against Spain, which will eventually lead to war. McKinley's assertion or rise to presidency began stronger rhetoric towards the Spanish and American politics. In the fall of 1897, McKinley came close to delivering an ultimatum to Spain that would have resulted in war, but the Spanish, also in 1897, relented. They ended reconcentration, they removed Butcher Weiler, and they gave autonomy to the Cubans, narrowly averting war. However, Spain's decision, while it was praised by Americans, was denounced by many in Spanish. Many Spanish in Cuba, I apologize, who responded to the decision by rioting and protesting, especially angered by talks of granting Cuba a type of self-governance, despite decades of Cuban struggles for independence. In response to the growing unrest, the U.S. sent the battleship Maine to Cuba in 1898. The Maine was aimed at protecting and helping to evacuate Americans residing in Cuba should any danger arise between the Spanish in Cuba and the Cuban residents. While at the same time the Maine was trying to give voice to the U.S.'s popular distaste for Spanish reconcentration policies. Initially sent under the pretext of a friendly visit, when the USS Maine sank, the U.S. had a pretext for going to war. The sinking of the Maine, combined with the Dillon letter, and yet another instance of sensationalist journalism, led to the declaration of war. So the explosion of the Maine on February 15, 1898 was really what sparked the beginning of the Spanish-American War. The explosion resulted in the death of 266 officers and naval men. The Spanish investigation of the explosion ruled it an accident and announced it was an internal explosion within the vessel. The American version, of course, reports the opposite, that the blast had been caused by a submarine mine. The report was later corrected for the United States in 1976 to show that the blast did in fact occur inside the ship and was most likely an accident. But at the time, the press ran away with this story, the idea that the Spanish had blown up the USS Maine, and came up with the tagline, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And it was this tagline that convinced politicians to declare war. The Spanish-American War, 1898, was a conflict between the United States and the Spanish that ended Spanish colonial rule in the Americas and resulted in U.S. acquisition of territories in the Western Pacific and Latin America. Initially, Spain agreed to U.S. demands and ended their policy of reconcentration and signed an armistice with the Cuban rebels. President McKinley and Wall Street at this time were not eager for a war with Spain, but were pushed into war by the public, the press, and in part Theodore Roosevelt, who savagely criticized McKinley for his reluctance to act. Wall Street and Mark Hanna feared that a war with Cuba would interfere with Cuban trade between the United States. But these two groups were among the only non-supporters for war in America at the time. McKinley did not see the value of Cuban independence to U.S. interest in the long term, but the public demanded intervention and an end to the abuse of Cubans. The Republican Party also pressured McKinley. The demand to preserve the place of the Republican Party in American politics became the deciding factor for the U.S. entry into the war. McKinley sent a war message to Congress on April 11, 1898, and urged armed intervention to free the oppressed Cubans, and Congress agreed. In April of 1898, Senator Henry M. Teller from Colorado proposed an amendment to the U.S. Declaration of War against Spain, which proclaimed that the United States would not establish permanent control over Cuba. It stated that the U.S., quote, hereby disclaims any disposition of intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island except for pacification thereof, and asserts its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people, end quote. The Senate passed the amendment on April 19th, and true to the letter of the Teller Amendment, after Spanish troops left the island in 1898, the U.S. occupied Cuba until 1902, and then allowed for independence. The Teller Amendment was succeeded by the Platt Amendment, which was introduced by Senator Orville Platt from Connecticut in April of 1901. It allowed for the United States, quote, the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. The Platt Amendment was not repealed until 1934. Alright, so the Spanish-American War itself, most of the war was fought in Cuba and the Philippines. The first battle was actually fought in the Philippines and not Cuba. On May 1st, 1898, at Manila Bay in the Philippines, the U.S. Asiatic Squadron destroyed the Pacific Spanish fleet. While the Secretary of War was away, Undersecretary of War Theodore Roosevelt, who was president later, cabled Commodore George Perry to attack Spain's Philippine outposts in the event of war. McKinley later confirmed these instructions, leading to the first major battle of the Spanish-American War on May 1st, 1898. Dewey's 6 warships sailed into the Manila harbor and destroyed all 10 of Spain's warships, killing and wounding 400 Spaniards with only 1 American death. Germans arrived at the battle after the Spanish surrendered with 5 warships, each of which was more powerful than those of Admiral Dewey. Despite this, Dewey threatened the German commander with war as soon as you like. From this is a false story emerged that the British had prevented the Germans from destroying the U.S. fleet. 3 months later, American troops arrived and captured Manila Bay in August with the aid of Filipino insurgents led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who later, after the U.S. annexed the Philippines, would lead an insurrection against the United States. The most famous of all the units fighting in Cuba was, of course, Roosevelt's Rough Riders. It was the name given to the first U.S. volunteer cavalry under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt actually resigned his position as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in May of 1898 in order to join and build this volunteer cavalry. The original plan for this unit was by filling it with men from the India Territory, the New Mexico Territory, Arizona, and Oklahoma. However, once Roosevelt joined the group, it quickly became a place for kind of a mixture of troops, ranging from Ivy League athletes to Glee Club singers to Texas Rangers and Indians. Roosevelt and the commander of the unit, Colonel Leonard Wood, trained and supplied the men so well that their camp in San Antonio, Texas, was more like a kind of mini town than a military camp. They're most remembered for their involvement with capturing San Juan Hill. In June, the U.S. Army and the 5th Corps landed on Cuba with the aim of marching to Santiago and launching a coordinated land and sea assault on the Spanish strongholds. Included among the U.S. ground troops were Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. The U.S. Army 5th Corps fought its way to Santiago's outer defenses. Eventually, they're going to be forced to split up, and they will successfully hold on to San Juan Hill. Alright, so I went through the Mexican-American War pretty quickly, or the Spanish-American War pretty quickly, I apologize. But there are some videos in there for you to watch, and make sure you read through your textbook and the notes in the slides, and the note section of these slides. Alright, so in the midst of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. also annexed Hawaii. The U.S. argued that they needed Hawaii to use as a naval station in order to send supplies and reinforcements to Dewey in Manila Harbor in the Philippines. The white-dominated government in Hawaii was eager to be annexed like Texas before it. This eagerness resulted in a joint annexation bill being approved by Congress and President McKinley. Hawaiians were granted U.S. citizenship, and eventually Hawaiians received full territory status in 1900. Right, so the Spanish-American War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1898. On December 10th, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the Spanish-American War. The once proud Spanish Empire was virtually dissolved as the United States took over much of Spain's overseas holdings. Puerto Rico, Spain's last vestige of the American Empire, and Guam were ceded to the United States. The Philippines were bought from Spain for about $20 million, and Cuba became a U.S. protectorate. However, Philippine insurgents who fought against the Spanish rule during the war immediately turned their guns against their new occupiers, and 10 times more U.S. troops died suppressing the Philippines than defeating the Spanish. During these negotiations, the Philippines became a major dilemma in the peace negotiations, since the U.S. had not taken Manila until the day after Spain had sued for peace. The Philippines, though they had been captured by the United States, were not considered part of the spoils of war. As a result, in order to retain the Philippines, the U.S. agreed to pay Spain $20 million for them. The imperialism debate in America was touched off by the spoils of war that resulted from the Spanish-American War and the Peace-Paris Treaty. The Philippines issue created a huge imperialism debate in the United States. Expansionist pressure from various groups, combined with the media frenzy and public outcry, forced President McKinley's hand. The Philippines and Hawaii were viewed by expansionists as necessary stepping stones towards Asian markets, especially China and Japan. Protestant missionaries were eager to convert Catholic Filipinos to their cause, and businessmen, especially iron tycoon Hanna, were clamoring for new markets in the Philippines as well as new resources and raw materials the Philippines could offer. All of these factors are what prompted McKinley to push for American possession of the Philippines. But this decision could come and did come at a great cost in the form of bloodshed. When, on February 4th, 1899, just 2 days before the U.S. Senate ratified the Paris Peace Treaty, fighting broke out between the American forces and Filipino nationalists led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who sought independence rather than just a change in colonial rulers. The ensuing Philippine-American War lasted 3 years and resulted in the deaths of over 4,200 Americans and over 20,000 Filipino combatants. As many as 200,000 Filipino civilians died from violence, famine, and disease as a result of this war. After the Spanish-American War, while the American public and politicians debated the annexation question, Filipino revolutionaries under Aguinaldo seized control of most of the Philippines' main island of Luzon. They proclaimed and established an independent Philippine Republic. When it became clear that the U.S. forces were intent on imposing American colonial control over the islands, the early clashes between the two sides in 1898 swelled into an all-out war. Americans tended to refer to the ensuing conflict as an insurgency or an insurrection, rather than acknowledging the Filipinos' connection to fighting and their dedication to warding off a foreign invader. There were 2 phases overall to the Philippine-American War. The first phase, from roughly February to November of 1899, was dominated by Aguinaldo's ill-fated attempts to fight a conventional war against the better trained and better equipped American troops. The second phase was marked by the Filipino shift to a guerrilla-style warfare. It began in November of 1899, and it lasted through the capture of Aguinaldo in 1901 and the spring of 1902, by which time most organized Filipino resistance had dissipated. President Teddy Roosevelt proclaimed a general amnesty and declared the conflict over on July 4, 1902, although minor uprisings and insurrections against America's rule periodically occurred in the years that followed. The United States entered the conflict with undeniable military advantages that included a trained fighting force, a steady supply of military equipment, and control of the archipelago's waterways. Meanwhile, the Filipino forces were hampered by their inability to gain any kind of outside support for their cause, chronic shortages of weapons and ammunitions, and complications produced by the Philippines' geographic complexities. Under these conditions, Aguinaldo's attempts to fight a conventional war in the first few months of the conflict proved to be a fatal mistake. The Filipino army suffered losses in men and material before switching to the guerrilla tactics that might have been effective if employed from the beginning of the conflict. The war was brutal on both sides. U.S. forces at times burned villages, implemented civilian reconcentration policies, and employed torture of suspected guerrillas and Filipino fighters. While Filipino fighters also tortured captured soldiers and terrorized civilians who cooperated with American forces. Many civilians died during the conflict as a result of the fighting. Cholera and malaria epidemics swept through during this war, and food shortages were caused because of several agricultural catastrophes. Even as the fighting went on, the colonial government of the United States established the Philippines in 1900 under the future president William Howard Taft, and they launched a pacification campaign that became known as the Policy of Attraction. Designed to win over key elites and other Filipinos who did not embrace Aguinaldo's plans for the Philippines, this policy of attraction permitted a significant degree of self-government, introduced social reforms, and implemented plans for economic development. Over time, this program gained important Filipino adherents and undermined the revolutionaries' popular appeal, which significantly added to U.S. military efforts to win the war. In 1907, the Philippines convened its first elected assembly, and in 1916, the Jones Act promised the nation eventual independence. The archipelago became an autonomous commonwealth in 1935, and the U.S. granted official independence in 1946. Not everyone in America was happy with the increasing conflict and attempts at colonization in the Philippines. Democrats in particular, especially William Jennings Bryan, who you remember from the Populism lecture, tended to be an anti-imperialist. They argued that America was morally wrong for building colonial empires, whereas Democrats, and other anti-imperialists, they feared concerns over foreign issues as overshadowing the kind of progressive gains that were needed at home. Some feared the foreign workers would lower wages at home, while still others feared that American factories would be relocated abroad, which was a valid fear. The formation of colonies abroad also posed a financial threat. Colonies would require a standing army to be established there, putting the U.S. soldiers who served in those armies in danger and increasing American taxes. Others even feared that the inclusion of colonies in the American empire would increase the so-called mongrelization of America, or an influx of, quote, uncivilized immigrants into the country. The result of this growing opposition was the formation of the Anti-Imperialist League, formed to oppose the policies of President McKinley and expansionists. The Anti-Imperialist League included such influential people as the presidents of Stanford and Harvard universities, the philosopher William James, Mark Twain, Samuel Gompers, and Andrew Carnegie. The League argued that the creation of the Philippines into a colony violated the consent of governed clause in the Declaration of Independence. The Filipinos wanted freedom, and annexation was going to war with them violated their right to choose their governance given by the Declaration. Anti-imperialists also feared that the allowance of such tyranny abroad would lead to tyranny at home. The conflict, they argued, would also gain very little for Americans despite politically and militarily entangling them in U.S. conflicts in Asia. Expansionists and imperialists responded to these claims by appealing to patriotism and the glory of annexation, by highlighting the possible trade profits of colonies, and by pointing to the abundance of natural resources available in the Philippines and elsewhere. Instead of oppressing the people, imperialists argued that the U.S. was helping to uplift and exploit the world's poor, that it was responsibility of the United States to help those less developed countries to advance them so that they could become self-governing in the future. So there were some Supreme Court cases that were focused on figuring out what to do with the people of these newly acquired territories. The insular cases are a series of cases that took place between 1901 and 1922, during which time the Supreme Court determined the constitutional and political status of these new territories. The main point of these debates was to determine whether the Constitution follows the flag, that is, whether and how constitutional provisions applied to these new acquisitions. For the most part, they determined that there is a difference between the territories. So, incorporated territories would be those that Congress intended to become part of the United States and eventually become states. They were directly protected by the Constitution as it was written. Unfortunately, unincorporated states or unincorporated territories that did not intend to become part of the United States were not protected by the Constitution. So there was a division. So places like Hawaii, where basically the Constitution followed the flag, you got all of the same privileges and rights as an American citizen once the country was annexed, versus places like the Philippines, where there were only certain rights that went with the flag and only certain things that you got that may not be exactly the same as what a US citizen would receive. Cuba was technically freed by the ending of the Spanish-American War and the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty, but Cuban independence was not an immediate result of the end of the war. After receiving Cuba as part of the peace treaty, the U.S. began setting up a military government under General Leonard Wood. This established U.S. government was successful in achieving advancements in Cuba's education, financial system, agriculture, public health systems, as well as curbing Cuba's yellow fever epidemic with the help of Dr. Walter Reed. After organizing the government and establishing a form of self-rule for Cuba, the U.S., in accordance with the Teller Amendment, withdrew from Cuba in 1902. Later, as I mentioned previously, the Platt Amendment was added to reinforce the Teller Amendment and protect Cuba from European empires. In an attempt to ensure U.S. influence in Cuban affairs, Cubans were forced to write the Platt Amendment into their own constitution in 1901. The amendment bound Cuba to agree to not impair their independence by signing a treaty or by contracting a debt beyond their resources. In essence, the U.S. government was given the right to approve all Cuban treaties. In addition to this provision, the amendment allowed the U.S. to send troops to restore order and provide mutual protection should another nation attack or an uprising occur. In order to help the protection of Cubans, Cuba also promised to sell or lease needed coaling and naval stations, the most famous of which is, of course, Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, which is still used. After the Spanish-American War, the resulting Philippine-American War, American nationalism took center stage in the public eye and became a central political, social, and economic issue of the coming decades. According to John Hay, the Spanish-American War was a splendid little war, and from the perspective of an American imperialist, that is largely true. The war was not long, it didn't cost Americans greatly in terms of lives or resources, and it did result in a great boost to America's image abroad, while also establishing our first overseas empire. The conflict also helped heal the rift between North and South that carried over from the Civil War, uniting Americans under one nation, one flag, and building patriotism. The war also gave validity to the Monroe Doctrine put forth by the U.S. in the 1820s, and all but ignored until the war with Spain ended. However, the war also created new concerns. Latin America became deeply suspicious of America's motives following the war. And though Britain became an ally of the U.S. because of the conflict, Germany grew more frustrated with their limited imperialistic successes and began to see the U.S. as an obstacle to their own imperialist aims. The resulting conflict in the Philippines drew America into conflict in Asia, which we'll be talking about shortly, and caused many Americans to grow fearful of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Responding to these new challenges, America began to invest in and build up her navy. Overall, nationalism grew out of an urban mass culture, industrial society intent on becoming a world power to rival European empires. Foreign powers in China, including the United States, were lured to the huge Chinese markets by the opportunity of greatly expanding their trade and the opportunity to convert Chinese to Christianity through missionary work. As a result, by the late 19th century, Japan and Western European powers had carved much of China into separate spheres of influence. Within each sphere, one nation held economic dominance. The U.S., despite having signed several trade deals with China in the 1850s and having active missionaries in China, had largely been left out of this race. U.S. manufacturers feared that Chinese markets were being lost to European powers and sought greater American interference. The result of this demand for greater voice and influence in China was the proposal of the Open Door Notes. Secretary of State John Hay, an ex-Lincoln secretary, first articulated the concept of the open door in China in a series of notes in 1899 to 1900. These open door notes aimed to secure international agreement to the U.S. policy of promoting equal opportunity for international trade and commerce in China, and respect for China's administrative and territorial integrity. British and American policies towards China had long operated under similar principles, but once Hay put them into writing, the open door became the official U.S. policy towards the Far East in the first half of the 20th century. The idea behind the open door notes originated with British and American China experts Alfred E. Hipsley and William W. Rockhill. Both men believed that their country's economic interest in China would be best protected and promoted by a formal agreement among the European powers on the principle of maintaining an open door for trade and commercial activity. Under their influence, Secretary Hay sent the first of the open door notes on September 6, 1899, to the other great powers that had interest in China, including Great Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan. These nations maintained significant physical and commercial presences in the United States and China, and were protective of their various spheres of influence. Hay proposed a free, open market and equal trading opportunity for merchants of all nationalities operating in China, based in part on the most favored nation clauses already established in the treaties of Wangxi and Tianjin. Hay argued that establishing equal access to commerce would benefit American traders and the U.S. economy, and hoped that the open door would also prevent disputes between the powers operating in China. For the United States, which held relatively little potential clout and no territory in China, the principle of non-discrimination in commercial activity was particularly important. Hay called for each of the powers active in China to do away with economic advantages for their own citizens within their spheres of influence, and also suggested that the Chinese tariffs apply universally and be collected by the Chinese themselves. Although other powers may not have agreed fully with these ideas, none openly opposed them. First, Hay sought the approval of the British and Japanese governments, both of which considered the American suggestion to be in their interests, although both conditioned their acceptance of the terms on the agreement that all the powers involved agree as well. France followed the British and Japanese example. This British, Japanese, and French endorsement of Hay's suggestion pressured Germany and Russia to adhere to the terms of the note as well, although Russia did not want to do so, so they eventually did so with many caveats, many of which practically negated the note's central principles. Nevertheless, Hay declared that all the powers had accepted the ideas with responses that were final and definitive. Though the policy was widely accepted in the U.S., it was weak and did not gain international acceptance. Unfortunately for the United States, making inroads into China would not be as easy as simply proposing a new policy and getting accepted by European empires. Millions of Chinese were enraged over the open door policy, and the U.S. was met with strong resistance from the Chinese royal family, especially the Dowager Empress Cixi. At the time, Chinese nationalists were completely outraged. This outrage culminated in 1900 with the rise of an anti-foreign movement known as the Boxer Rebellion. Boxers, or Chinese nationalists, with the support of the Empress and Chinese Imperial Army, killed over 200 missionaries and other whites, including a number of foreign diplomats besieged in Beijing. In response to this violence, European nations, including Japan, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, and the United States, pulled together a force of about 18,000 men and arrived to put down the rebellion. This multinational coalition was successful in ending the uprising and restoring trade, and it assessed an indemnity against China in the form of $333 million, which the United States eventually forgave. In response to their loss and declining imperial power, the Chinese government began to set aside money to educate a select group of Chinese students in the United States as a gesture of goodwill. These students would later play a significant role in westernizing Asia. In the midst of the Boxer Rebellion and troubles abroad, the U.S. held the 1900 presidential elections. Republicans nominated William McKinley as he had won the Spanish-American War, helped the U.S. acquire new territories, protected the gold standard, and brought economic prosperity. McKinley ran on a platform that endorsed prosperity, the gold standard, and overseas expansion. Theodore Roosevelt was nominated to run as McKinley's vice president due to his popularity with the Rough Riders. Similar to the election of 1896, the Democratic Party again nominated William Jennings Bryan, but he ran with an ill-conceived platform, once again calling for free silver, an issue that had faded at the end of the Depression. Again, similar to the 1896 campaign, McKinley waged a front porch campaign, while Bryan's campaign was throughout the nation, giving speeches that criticized the Republicans' imperialist policies and gave support of trusts. Unfortunately for Bryan, Americans had grown less concerned about imperialism and more accepting of expanding abroad. Teddy Roosevelt, who was traveling to help McKinley's campaign, out-campaigned Bryan and cut into his Midwestern following by claiming that Bryan would rock the boat of prosperity. The efforts of Roosevelt, combined with the poor campaign platform of Bryan, led to Bryan defeating McKinley 292 to 155 in the Electoral College and by nearly 1 million popular votes. Unfortunately, President McKinley will be assassinated shortly after taking office in September of 1901 by a deranged anarchist and Polish immigrant Leon Slezolska. With the assassination of President McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, not quite 43, became the youngest president in the nation's history and the first president to play a significant role in world affairs. He brought new excitement and power to the presidency, and he vigorously led Congress and the American public towards progressive reforms and a strong foreign policy. He took the view that the president served as a steward of the people and should take whatever action necessary for the public good, unless expressly forbidden by law or the Constitution. As president, Roosevelt held the idea that the government should be the great arbiter of the conflicting economic forces in the nation, especially between capital and labor, guaranteeing justice to each and dispensing favors to none. Roosevelt emerged spectacularly as a trust buster by forcing the dissolution of a great railroad combination in the Northwest, and other similar antitrust suits under the Sherman Act followed. Roosevelt steered the United States more actively into world politics. He liked to quote a favorite proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," in regards to U.S. expansionist policies. Aware of the strategic need for a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific, Roosevelt ensured the construction of the Panama Canal. His corollary to the Monroe Doctrine prevented the establishment of foreign bases in the Caribbean and aggregated the sole right of intervention in Latin America to the United States. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the Russo-Japanese War, which we'll talk about in a minute, and he was a champion of conservation. Alright, so the Panama Canal. Please watch the video linked here to understand how the Panama Canal got its start under the French Empire and how America came into the picture later, and about the background on the violence that actually created the Panama Canal. In 1903, the Spanish-American War showed the need for a canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The U.S. now needed to protect Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines and their merchant ships. But in order to create such a canal, the U.S. needed to overcome a certain legal challenge called the Clayton-Buller Treaty of 1850, which prohibited any country from securing exclusive control over a canal in Central America, meaning that in order to build the canal, the U.S. would need to collaborate with European empires. The canal also seemed to be an architectural and engineering conundrum. Between 1878 and 1889, the building of the Suez Canal struggled. It was very difficult to successfully cover this area. The 1901 Hay-Pontifus Treaty between Britain and the U.S. paved the way for the U.S. involvement in the canal by granting the U.S. the right to build the canal and the right to fortify it. Britain was occupied at the time with their own threats to their empire in the Boer War in South Africa. Unfortunately, the Colombian Senate rejected this treaty with the U.S. for control over the canal and the Panama, declaring that the U.S. was inadequate for such a valuable region. The rejection of the treaty by the Colombian Senate led to the U.S. resorting to gunboat diplomacy to resolve the Panama issue. As the video on the previous slide explained, French Representative Philip Buenaventura worked with Panama revolutionaries to raise a tiny army and gain independence from Colombia, so that the newly created Panama government, created out of this revolution, could approve American construction on the canal and override the decisions of the Colombian government. Their efforts proved successful, and on November 3, 1903, the Panama Revolution began. In order to provide assistance but not be directly involved in the conflict, U.S. naval forces blockaded Colombian troops from access to the Isthmus River. On November 6th of the same year, President Roosevelt extended official recognition of Panama. The revolution resulted in the signing of the Buenaventura Treaty in November of 1903. Buenaventura, now the Panamanian Prime Minister, despite being a French citizen, signed the treaty in Washington with Secretary of State John Hay. The treaty granted the United States the right to build the Panama Canal. Under the treaty, the U.S. would pay the Panama Canal Company $40 million for the lands to build on, and then widen the canal zone from 6 miles to 10 miles. The Panama Canal was completed in 1914 and cost about $400 million in 1914, not accounting for inflation. So now it would be significantly higher than that. And on this slide, you see then and now pictures of the canal. In his annual message to Congress in 1904 and 1905, President Teddy Roosevelt expanded the Monroe Doctrine. The corollary stated that not only were the nations of the Western Hemisphere not open to colonization by European powers, but that the United States had the responsibility to preserve order and protect life and property in those countries, basically establishing us as a world police. European intervention in Latin America, if you recall the Platt Amendment, resurfaced as an issue in the U.S. foreign policy when European governments began to use force to pressure Latin American countries to repay their debts. For example, British, Germany, and Italian gunboats blockaded Venezuela's ports in 1902 in an event known as the Venezuela Crisis, when the Venezuelan government defaulted on its debts to foreign bondholders. Many Americans worried that European intervention in Latin America would undermine their country's traditional dominance in the region. To keep other powers out and ensure financial solvency, President Roosevelt issued his corollary, basically stating that chronic wrongdoing may, in America as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some, quote, civilized nation. He announced in his annual message to Congress in December of 1904. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherents of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States to, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Roosevelt tied his policy to the Monroe Doctrine, and it was also consistent with his foreign policy of walk softly but carry a big stick. Roosevelt stated that in keeping with the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. was justified in exercising international police power to put an end to chronic unrest or wrongdoing in the Western Hemisphere. The so-called Roosevelt corollary, a corollary is an extension of a previous idea, to the Monroe Doctrine contained a great irony. The Monroe Doctrine had been sought to prevent European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, but now the Roosevelt corollary justified American intervention throughout the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt announced that in future financial crises concerning Latin American debt, the U.S. would intervene, take over customs houses, pay off the debts, and keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. So we've been focusing for much of this lecture on Latin America and the Pacific, but America was also involved in Asia at this time, specifically in the resolution of the Russo-Japanese War and trade in Japan and China. Russia and Japan went to war over the issue of ports in Manchuria and Korea. Following the Russian rejection of a Japanese plan to divide Manchuria and Korea into spheres of influence, Japan launched a surprise naval attack against Port Arthur, a Russian naval base in China. The Russian fleet was decimated. During the subsequent Russo-Japanese War, Japan won a series of decisive victories over the Russians, who underestimated the military potential of its non-Western opponent. In January of 1905, the strategic naval base of Port Arthur fell to the Japanese naval forces under Admiral Tokugawa. In March, Russian troops were defeated in China by Japanese Field Marshal Oyama, and in May, the Russian Baltic Fleet was defeated by Admiral Zinoviev. These three major defeats convinced Russia that further resistance against Japan's imperial designs for Eastern Asia was hopeless, and in August of 1905, U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt mediated a peace treaty called the Treaty of Portsmouth, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Japan emerged from the conflict as the first non-Western world power and set its sights on greater imperial expansion. Japan's defeat of Russia marked the first defeat of non-European powers since the Turkish invasion of southern Europe in the 1500s. However, for Russia, its military's disastrous performance in the war was one of the immediate causes of the Russian Revolution of 1905. As the Russo-Japanese War drew to an end, Japan, though it had been highly successful in the war campaigns, was beginning to run low on men and money, and sought a peaceable and advantageous end to the conflict. In order to achieve this, Japan sought secretly to reach out to President Roosevelt to assist in sponsoring peace negotiations. Roosevelt, eager to ensure that neither side gained a monopoly in Asia or threatened the U.S.-held Philippines, agreed to assist in negotiations. The result, as mentioned in the previous slide, was the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. Both sides met in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to discuss their terms and allow President Roosevelt to mediate this process. The Japanese came demanding a huge indemnity from Russia and all of the strategic islands that they had captured. However, Russia refused to concede defeat. Eventually, the two nations came to an agreement that Japan would gain the southern half of the islands, but no indemnity. Secretly, Roosevelt also agreed to accept future Japanese dominance of Korea, though this was not officially stated in the treaty. Not all results of the treaty were positive, however. By negotiating the treaty, U.S. relations with Russia suffered. Russians viewed Roosevelt as a tyrant who robbed them of a military victory. Japan also felt robbed and blamed the U.S. for not receiving an indemnity. A naval arms race between the U.S. and Japan grew out of the conflict and resulted in a growing mutual distrust between the two nations. The Russo-Japanese War also created problems for Americans at home in the form of new immigrants fleeing the war to arrive in America, especially in California. Those who did arrive in the U.S. faced strong resistance from the American public, and one of the most well-known examples of U.S. nativism from the time period, the San Francisco School Board Incident of 1906. By 1906, nearly 70,000 Japanese immigrants had come to California due to dislocation and tax burdens caused by the Russo-Japanese War. Californians feared that they were being confronted with another, quote, yellow peril, and feared mongrelization of the races, and responded to this fear by creating the politically influential Asian Exclusion League. Influenced by this league and the growing public unrest, the San Francisco School Board ruled that Asian children should attend special schools. San Francisco had been devastated by the 1906 earthquake, and the school system was considered too strained to handle the large influx of Asian immigrants. The decision outraged the people of Japan, who were highly sensitive to race issues and cried discrimination in the world press. The issue grew so dire that President Roosevelt began to fear a war breaking out in California and other states. In response to this unrest, Roosevelt called the entire San Francisco School Board to the White House and coerced them to repeal the segregation order and accept what came to be known as the Gentleman's Agreement. The agreement centered on two key points: the Japanese government agreeing to stop the flow of laborers to the United States, and Californians agreeing to not ban Japanese children from public schools. The agreement was successful in ending the conflict and the threat of war, armed resistance in California, but issues with immigrants continued in the state. The declining U.S.-Japanese relations and the increasing Japanese perception of the U.S. as a weak nation promoted President Roosevelt to send the Great White Fleet on a highly visible tour around the world, particularly around Asia, in 1907. Roosevelt regarded the journey of his fleet as his most important contribution to peace and was successful in forming several agreements with Japan as a result of his voyage. The election of President Taft marked a departure from Roosevelt's imperialistic foreign policies, namely carry a big stick policies, and the implementation of a new foreign policy strategy known as dollar diplomacy. From 1909 to 1913, President William Howard Taft and Secretary of State Philander C. Knox followed dollar diplomacy as their guiding foreign policy strategy. Taft shared the view held by Knox, a corporate lawyer who had founded the giant conglomerate U.S. Steel, that the goal of diplomacy was to create stability and order abroad that would best promote American commercial interests. Knox felt that not only was the goal of diplomacy to improve financial opportunities, but also to use private capital to further U.S. interests overseas. Dollar diplomacy was evident in the extension of U.S. intervention in Caribbean and Central America, especially in measures undertaken to safeguard American financial interests in the region. In China, Knox secured the entry of the U.S. American banking conglomerate headed by J.P. Morgan into a European finance consortium financing the construction of a railway from Huanggang to Canton. In spite of successes, dollar diplomacy failed to counteract economic instability and the tide of revolution in places like Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and China. The policy was characterized by two aspects. U.S. foreign policy would serve to protect Wall Street dollars invested abroad, and Wall Street dollars would in turn be used to uphold U.S. foreign policy. The policy sought to reduce rivals between Germany in the form of taking advantage of financial chaos in the Caribbean. In terms of foreign policy, Taft is known for his attempts to combat the Manchurian Railroad, a collection of railroads owned by Russia and Japan spanning across China. Taft saw this railroad as a monopoly created by Russia and Japan that was a significant threat to America's open-door policy in China. In 1909, Taft proposed that a group of U.S. and foreign bankers buy the railroads and turn them over to China. China would pay the U.S. and other investors back from the profits of the railroad. But this plan was ill-conceived from the start, as Japan and Russia refused to give up any of the important railroad lines. The event, which came to be referred to as the Manchurian Railroad Scheme, resulted in a wave of criticism for President Taft and in demonstration of limits of the open-door policy in China. Under Taft's policy of dollar diplomacy, the U.S. government urged Wall Street bankers to pump money into Honduras, Haiti, and keep out foreign funds by extending foreign influence. The investment ultimately led to U.S. troops sent to Cuba, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua to restore order. In 1914, U.S. entered the Dominican Republic to supervise new elections, and in 1915, under President Wilson, interfered in Haiti due to alleged instability of the government, and forced Haitians to sign a treaty which allowed repayment of national debt through borrowing huge sums of U.S. dollars. This gave American control over Haiti's finances and policy and made Haiti an American protectorate. By 1928, the U.S. abandoned the Roosevelt Corollary and in 1930 adopted the Good Neighbor policy instead of the Big Stick policy. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the Caribbean was secure under the wing of the Americans. U.S. imperialism has continued in the region even after independence and remains as a ghost that takes the credibility away from true Cuban independence. Alright, please watch this video. It's about 12 minutes long and it will help you. It's kind of a recap of the last couple slides. Alright, so imperialism and President Wilson. And Wilson is going to, of course, be the president for World War I, so we're going to talk a lot more about him. Wilson absolutely hated imperialism, and at least initially he recoiled from an aggressive foreign policy. Wilson was repelled by the big stick policies of Roosevelt and the dollar diplomacy policies of Taft, yet Wilson would eventually intervene in Latin America more than any other president in U.S. history. He's pressured by U.S. corporations who had invested money abroad. Wilson would be forced to protect American interests in Latin America or face bankruptcy and unrest. Initially, Wilson proclaimed that the U.S. government would no longer offer special support to American investors in Latin America and China. Wilson repealed the Panama Canal Tolls Act, which had exempted the U.S. from shipping tolls, provoking protests from Great Britain. And Wilson enacted the Jones Act in 1916, which granted the Philippines territorial status and promised independence when a stable government was established. This act would lead to the Philippines receiving their independence 30 years later in 1946. A similar act to the Jones Acts of 1970 gave Puerto Ricans the status of U.S. citizenship as well. Unfortunately, Wilson, like Roosevelt, faced issues over immigration in California. California legislatures prohibited Japanese Americans from owning land, again outraging Japanese people on a global scale. The result was Japanese protests and the fear that Japan would attack the Philippines. Secretary of State Bryan went to California and pleaded with the state government to soften its stand, and tensions did ease somewhat, but the problems remained through World War I. Imperialist policies under Wilson were intended to reinforce U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere during World War I. Wilson kept Marines in Nicaragua to maintain order after they landed there in 1912, and the U.S. had taken control of customs. In effect, Nicaragua became an official U.S. protectorate. U.S. forces were also sent to Haiti 1914 to 1915 when Haitian president was killed in an effort to protect U.S. lives and property. And they were also sent in 1916 into the Democratic Republic. All of these were issues taking place while World War I was in effect in Europe or the United States. Also, under Wilson was the issue of the Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910. At the roots of the Mexican Revolution were two fundamental contradictions produced by the process of modernization during the reign of Porfirio Diaz. In the economic sphere, the upper classes and foreign investors benefited from export-led development, while peasants and rural workers suffered its regressive effects. In the political sphere, the autocratic rule led to the political system and excluded the majority of the population from political participation. When Diaz was reelected for the 7th time as president in the fraudulent election, it was the opposition candidate, Madero, who led an insurrection that marked the beginning of the revolution in 1910. The elected government of Madero, which came to power following the fall of Diaz in May of 1911, disagreed from the start with the political forces that aimed at far-reaching social and economic transformation in Mexico, most notably substantial land reforms. Madero was overthrown in 1913 by a conservative coup led by General Heredo. While Heredo's government remained internationally isolated within Mexico, only the northern states refused to recognize Heredo from the start. From these states, a military campaign was initiated against his regime, which was joined by forces led by Francisco Pancho Villa in Chihuahua. Villa was a former outlaw, small businessman, and colonel in the insurrection of 1910. After a civil war between March 1913 and July 1914, the so-called constitutionalist forces, together with Zapata's army, removed Heredo from power. Going forward, the revolution developed into various entanglements with the First World War. During the American Revolution between the Mexican Revolution, between 1910 and 1917, the United States government ordered 2 military incursions into Mexico. The first entailed an invasion and occupation of the city of Veracruz in 1914, and the second was the punitive expedition of 1916 to 1917, commanded by General John J. Pershing. Woodrow Wilson was reluctant to send U.S. troops to Mexico in 1914, but yielded to pressure from American business interests, cabinet members, newspapers, and representatives of the Southwest. Reluctant or not, Wilson desired to depose the government of General Heredo by seizing the port of Veracruz, through which flowed most of the armaments and supplies imported for the Mexican army. Wilson's quarrel with Heredo was twofold. First, he could not maintain order and protect U.S. private and public interests in Mexico. And second, he was a dictator who imposed himself on the Mexican Republic after murdering his democratically elected predecessor. American warships arrived on the scene in April of 1914 and shelled the city, taking a terrible toll on the civilian population, which had decided to resist the invasion. At the same time, the U.S. Navy and Marines seized the opportunity to experiment with amphibious landing techniques and an almost comic opera effect. Between the landing and the occupation, which lasted through November, U.S. troops did help oversee the removal of Herrera from office, mainly by supplying the revolutionary forces with arms and other critical materials. When a revolutionary faction, headed by Francisco Pancho Villa, staged a raid on the town of Columbus, New Mexico in 1916, killing 16 Americans in the process, Wilson ordered a force under General Pershing to find and capture Villa, and thus eliminate the threat that Villa's band of 500 posed along the U.S.-Mexican border. With 12,000 soldiers, observation aircraft, cavalry, and motorized supply vehicles and supports, the punitive expedition penetrated 419 miles into Mexico in search of the outlaws. They encountered serious resistance only a few times and never found Villa. In the meantime, with the Americans chasing after him, Villa's popularity mushroomed, as did his band of combatants, which grew to number about 5,000 by the time President Wilson ordered Pershing to withdraw in January of 1917. Under a new constitution, just a few weeks later, Carranza was actually elected president, and not long after that, Pershing was appointed commander of the American Expeditionary Force, the nation's most important contribution to the Allied war efforts during World War I. Alright, so this is just a really quick review of the presidents we've talked about so far, so just make sure you're familiar with them. Harding we will get to more in the next section we start talking about the 1920s, but keep him in mind. And then just a major recap of the events in this lecture, so just make sure that you are familiar with the events of the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, the trade issues and open door policy and Boxer Rebellion issues with Japan and China, the creation of the Panama Canal, Roosevelt and the Monroe Doctrine, so Roosevelt's corollary, the ideas of dollar diplomacy under Taft, and then, of course, the issues in Mexico with Wilson. All right, and then I also would encourage you to watch the American Imperialism crash course lecture. It's only about 10 minutes long, and it's a great summary if you just need to kind of a quick snapshot of the time period.